our public silence earlier this year during escalated military conflict between Israeli armed forces and forces based in the occupied Palestinian territories. So those weeks resulted in many, many tragic deaths of Palestinian and Israeli civilians, and also have sparked renewed reflection throughout the international community about the status of the peace process in the region and human rights violations Palestinians continue to face living under Israeli military occupation. We believe as an organization that this conflict must be approached in a courageous and a sensitive way, informed by international human rights law and standards as negotiations continue to unfold. We recognize our failure to speak up earlier this year on these matters when it was needed. And we believe that leadership in our division and NAPA more broadly were similarly not adequately responsive. We're also cognizant in holding tonight's event of the broader climate in the US and US psychology of limited recognition and discrimination against Middle Eastern and North African communities, including APA's collaboration in state violence against MENA detainees documented in the Hoffman report. We deeply regret and reject these conditions, and we're very appreciative of our friends and peers in AMENA-Psy's willingness to be in collaboration and dialogue with us as we continue to address our organization's shortcomings in attending to these important issues. So we invite others on the call tonight invested in the psychological impacts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically, and in promoting and protecting the human rights and mental health of Palestinians and Israelis, to stay in communication with us as an organization about your ideas and interests for future programming related to this. And you can reach us at our email, and I'll drop it in the chat here, which is div17sas@gmail.com. So following the panel, the presenters will take questions from the audience. You can submit these throughout the presentation through Zoom's Q&A function. We'll be selecting questions pertinent to the topic of the presentation. If we're unable to get to your question because of time or because it falls outside of the scope of tonight's specific discussion, but it pertains to other aspects of Palestinian and Israeli human rights and mental health, anti-MENA discrimination, or anti-Semitism, again, we encourage you to reach out to us at div17sas@gmail.com about additional programming that we can organize and other ways that we can provide support. So with that, I'll transition to introductions of tonight's panelists. Thank you so much for being here. And Bahar, if you could launch the slides as well. Great. So here we go. So Bahar Amini serves as the AMENA-Psy executive, on the AMENA-Psy executive board as a student member at large, and is also the chair of the student committee. Khadija Najer serves on the AMENA-Psy student committee as the community engagement chair. And Mohammed El Nakib and Dr. Layli Kagani are co-chairs of the AMENA-Psy advocacy committee. Thank you so much all again. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who is here. I'm just overwhelmed with joy seeing the chat and just the list of attendees that are here. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to take very brief minutes to give some background for those who aren't aware of what is AMENA-Psy. We are the American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association. We are small, but we are mighty, and we are definitely growing. We are one of the 5 ethnic minority psychological associations that are acknowledged by APA, but we were just established in 2017, so we are super new. But I do think it's important for us to share our mission, which is to build a supportive network to enhance the professional development of the American Arab and MENA psychological workforce, as well as to promote the well-being of Arab MENA communities in North America through research, education, advocacy, and the advancement of ethical practice. There's a lot more information about us on our website at amenasci.org. And I will say that I'm just really grateful for SAS to reach out to me and the student committee to collaborate on this event. As someone who served as a SAS rep at my university for 4 years, I worked very closely with SAS, and I'm just really excited to be presenting with my friend Khadija, and also advocacy committee co-chairs Mohammed and Layli. And so without further ado, I will pass it on to Khadija. Oh, I'm sorry, my bad. Let me tell the agenda first. We're going to start with the brief history and background that Khadija will be doing, and then we'll move into the second half will be really related to the advocacy piece, some of the challenges that we experience in wanting to advocate, and also how to be an ally with the Palestinian and MENA community. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. And now Khadija can take the stage.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Khadija. I am a fourth-year counseling psych student at Cleveland State University. I, as Bahar said, student committee, social media / community engagement chair, student committee member, chair of the social media. I'm a Palestinian American. I am first generation. My parents are immigrants, and just everyone being here today means more than I can express, than like people from Palestinian community and broad can express. So just thank you. And I'm probably going to cry at some point during this, so just don't mind my tears. They're happy tears. Okay. So the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is long and pretty complex. The history of the conflict is pretty important to know, especially because it's so intricately tied to the history of Palestine. However, in the interest of time, I'd like to show this short clip by the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a Jewish American grassroots peace organization. So Bahar, if you could play that.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state, but now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders, In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do, but the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
Thanks for taking the time to watch this, and thank you, Bahar, for playing it. So, all right, that's the conflict in a nutshell. Like I said, there's a lot more to it. But as we all saw the video, the whole situation began with the forced removal of Palestinians. We, the Palestinians, call this day the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe in Arabic. This day is also referred to as Israeli Independence Day. So the Palestinian mourning of loss and the Israeli celebration of statehood occur simultaneously. And this dichotomy has existed since the Nakba and until this day. And then to learn more about the history of Palestine, feel free to check out our resources on our resources page. So first and foremost, before we talk about Palestinians in the US, let's talk about the US's role in Palestine a little bit more. So like the video said, the US has been funding Israel for quite some time. We, the United States, donate about $3 billion annually to Israel, and that happened even during the past pandemic year. A significant amount of this money, 74%, is spent on acquiring defense equipment from the US as well as other services and training. Also, Trump officially recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This is significant and not great for Palestinians. Presidents previous to Trump were skating around this issue for a while. Jerusalem is a very contested piece of the land because there are Christian, Muslim, and Jewish holy places there. It's a very powerful piece of land to claim. The US also generally generally sides with Israel during times of war. The United Nations has accused them of committing numerous war crimes, but the US tends to ignore the human rights violations that they commit. The topic of Israel is so strongly supported that there's a whole lobby group that exists in our US government for the purpose of increasing or changing US foreign policy in Israel's interests. The support is so strong that politicians and even previous presidents have been criticized and silenced with bipartisan support for discussing any criticism of Israel's policies and military practices. So let's touch a bit on those human rights violations that I just mentioned. So the Human Rights Watch is an organization that conducts regular and systematic investigations of human rights abuses around the world. They recently documented the crimes of apartheid and persecution by the Israeli authorities in a recently published extensive report that's also on our resource page if you're interested. Among the crimes that the Human Rights Watch have noted are mass evictions of Palestinians from their homes, arrests and detainments of Palestinians regardless of age or crime. This means that 12-year-old boys, for example, are being arrested on the street at random times. Israel also controls Palestinians' access to resources and tends to restrict them pretty significantly. And this includes inhibiting enough COVID vaccines from reaching Palestinians. They also have control over the borders that cause significant inconveniences to Palestinians because these borders, they're not like statehood borders the way we have them here in the US. They cut in and out of villages in some places. In the case of Gaza, it's just like a border around the whole city. So they also restrict airspace and they control who comes in, who comes out, when you can visit, when people in Palestine can leave. It just controls it all. So the war in Palestine is not just a physical war. The IDF engaged in psychological warfare on Palestinians, so much so that the DSM trauma diagnoses don't quite capture their experiences. So over in Palestine, instead of using PTSD, they started coining this continuous traumatic stress concept because it's more reflective of their realities. They've been living in this state of trauma literally for generations. And then Gazans have more traumatic symptoms than those in the West Lake, just because Gaza is more or less like an open air prison. Like I said before, the borders are completely controlled and it's enclosed around the whole city. So when there's warfare, they do not have a way out. They're stuck in that space. Palestinians that don't live in Palestine are among an about 6 million person global diaspora. In terms of Palestinians in the United States, we don't have the exact number, and that's because the US Census doesn't account for Arabs in general, much less accounting for us by our family's ethnic origins. There's a significant Palestinian refugee population as well. A recent study showed that refugees experience distress from lack of services, camps being overcrowded, and just not having the space and safety to cope with their stress and trauma. Palestinians are experiencing a collective generational trauma due to the diaspora, due to the history of the Nakba and current events in Palestine. We experience trauma from the separation of our families, from vicarious trauma from watching what's happening to our families in Palestine. And then there's some survivor's guilt that comes along with it. Sorry, guys, give me a second. Palestinians also experience significant identity invalidation. A phrase that we Palestinians use a lot is to exist is to resist. And this is because we live and exist in environments that more often than not invalidate our right to simply exist. These invalidating environments include the country of the United States, given our government's loyalties, and even academic environments, or academic environments that claim to support the oppressed, to the indigenous, and then in the same breath adamantly exclude Palestinians and Palestinian rights from those conversations. Palestinians are suffering and they notice the world's response. I'm going to read a quote that reflects one of the many voices in Palestine. It's from a 14-year-old Palestinian boy. He says, "The world has been oppressing us as Palestinian refugees and has not given us any of our rights. There is no international justice in this world, and the world always stands beside the mighty people and not beside weak people like us." Thank you.
With that, well, thank you, Khadija, for such a wonderful first half, giving us an overview, and that quote gets me too, so I had to get it together. We'll now move into that second part with Mohammed and Layli and talking about advocacy.
Thank you so much, Bahar, and thank you to Khadija. I know that this topic can be very difficult to discuss, and I want to first and foremost recognize that my privilege in the sense that I'm not a Palestinian, but I am able to hold the space and collaborate with everybody to hold the space for Palestinian people and to talk about this issue. And so thank you again to SAS for collaborating with us on this event. So first and foremost, let's talk about the suppression of Palestinian advocacy. So there have been efforts to silence Palestinian human rights. Palestine's human rights advocacy has been well documented in the United States. So a lot of people in the United States who don't have MENA identities may not know a lot about Palestine, even though the United States has had a deep involvement in Israel. Because in large part, there are efforts to suppress speech in the US as it relates to Palestine. These efforts have been very well documented. The Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal wrote a report after extensive research that found that folks who speak up in defense of Palestinian human rights are often censored and punished, and that this is very much widespread and well organized. So let's talk about how they do this. So essentially, pro-Israel advocacy organizations, public relations firms, and think tanks, they leverage their resources and lobbying power to pressure universities, government actors, and other institutions to censor or punish Palestine human rights advocacy. Many institutions are very quick to punish or cause an uproar when anyone discusses human rights abuses that are going on in Palestine. So criticizing any Israeli government practices and supporting Palestinian human rights can essentially come at a very high cost for advocates. There are a few measures, there's many measures that are used to silence Palestinian advocates, and to name a few, which believe it or not, some of us have actually experienced recently, there could be accusations of one supporting terrorism or being anti-Semitic. In addition, there might be attempts to cancel or water down any Palestine-censored academic and cultural events. So for example, this actually happened to us while trying to host this event. There were people that tried to shut this event down, unfortunately. In addition, there can be administrative sanctions against student groups that are involved in Palestine advocacy. So universities, for example, will take away funding from student groups after placing them on probation because they create events that are centered around Palestine. In addition, there have been campaigns that target academics that are critical of Israeli policies or supportive of Palestinian human rights. So, for example, one of the reasons that Dr. Cornel West, as I'm sure some of you have heard, was not granted tenure at Harvard was due to his pro-Palestinian advocacy. So there have been many academics that experience pro-Palestinian views that are removed from their positions within universities and other academic institutions. And finally, there have also been investigations and even criminal prosecution of Palestinian advocates. So it's really important when we talk about Palestine to talk about building collective safety. How do we build collective safety? So we do this by building awareness and having more people speak up. Now, we just shared all of these punitive measures that are used against folks who engage in Palestinian advocacy. And we don't share all of this to scare any of you from speaking up, but rather to actually encourage you in helping us build collective safety around Palestinian advocacy. So the more of us who speak up about Palestine, the safer that we all become. Why? Because it is harder to target people who speak up when many people are raising their voices. And we see a change in the discourse with more people becoming aware and talking about Palestine. So we're seeing this change of more people speaking up. And we saw this particularly last May during the Israeli strikes on Gaza and the forced removal of the families in Sheikh Jarrah. So more and more people are becoming aware of the situation and speaking up in the name of human rights and social justice. It's really important to highlight the urgency to educate ourselves and educate others. The more that we understand and spread the education, like I said, the safer it is for all of us to speak up, and therefore the blacklisting that occurs to people like academics and researchers will not be meaningful at all. So the more that we educate people, the safer it will be for all of us to speak up about these injustices. One very important thing to mention is that there's an unfair burden on Palestinians to do all of this educating and advocacy. And it's really problematic because we must all take the responsibility. If we only leave it to Palestinians to speak up, it's an unfair burden to place on them to educate everybody. And they are the people that are most impacted and most vulnerable. So we have to call on our allies with the most power and privilege to be able to speak up and educate others. So I'm sure all of you are wondering how to support Palestinian advocacy as psychologists or students. So number one, academically, it's important to encourage your academic institutions to include literature on the lived experiences of Palestinians in curriculum. So if you are a professor, it's really important to include these kinds of articles and these experiences within your curriculum. It's also very important to advocate for inclusion of an Arab or MENA category in demographic forms. And we see this a lot with the We Are MENA campaign, for example. So if you all want to learn more about that, please visit our website. Research-wise, it's important to conduct or share research on mental health inequities that are affecting Palestinians. And I believe there are many research articles out there that talk about this, but unfortunately, sometimes, as I'm sure you all just heard, that it can be sort of blacklisted so that people do not read or see these kinds of research. Clinically, it's really important to create a safe space for Palestinian and MENA patients or clients to talk about their experiences of discrimination and systemic oppression. So as we all, I'm sure now know, anti-Palestinian speech is very widespread. So as psychologists, as clinicians, we don't want to do this, let's play devil's advocate. Okay, we want to make space for the experiences of Palestinians. Why? Because we want to understand the context in order to receive it in a welcoming way. So that way we don't further traumatize them. And as allies, finally, as allies, it's important to show solidarity through action. So when we work with other allies to coordinate effective responses to anti-Palestinian speech in psychology spaces, we're essentially uplifting psychologists that are Palestinian or MENA identifying. So for instance, how SAS reached out to the MENA-Psy leadership to hold this event in collaboration. And again, we really do appreciate that you all did this. And finally, it's important to connect with organizations such as AMENA-Psy to attend ongoing educational events about inclusion in psychological research and practice. So use us as a resource to gain better understanding and more education. So psychologists and Palestinian advocacy, it's really important that we talk about what happens when psychologists hear the word Palestine. So many of us may encounter that it is outside of our scope of practice as psychologists to comment on Israel and Palestine. So you may even hear that there are arguments that it is a violation of psychology ethics to publicly participate in Palestinian advocacy. So it's really important to remember that these arguments reflect attempts to suppress criticism of Israeli government practices and advocacy for Palestinian human rights. As a matter of fact, if anyone brings up the argument of the code of ethics, it's important to remember that our code of ethics enshrines principles of justice and respect for people's rights and dignities. And this is essentially at the heart of the movement for Palestinian liberation. Furthermore, psychologists have had an extensive history of speaking up on human rights and social justice issues. So it is absolutely within our scope of practice to comment on structural and systemic issues that impact community and individual well-being.
So now we will discuss how to talk about Palestine. So when this comes up, either in your professional or educational or research settings, we're hoping to provide you with some guidelines on how to approach it. First, educate yourself and others in your spheres of influence. So attending this webinar is a great start. We encourage you to read more about the subject and to read between the lines of some of the media reports, which may be biased. We have provided a resource page and we encourage you to share it with others. We also direct you to AMENA-Psy, our website, social media, statements, upcoming conference in September, and future webinars. The more you learn, the more you can share, the more empowered you and others will feel, and the stronger the movement for justice will become. Next, we encourage you to challenge and disrupt narratives that portray and falsely accuse Palestine advocacy as anti-Semitic or in support of terrorism. Please don't settle for dominant narratives on this issue. Look deeper. Often folks who would otherwise be allies are intimidated into silence because anti-Zionism is falsely equated with terrorism and is falsely portrayed as anti-Semitism. The truth is that Arabs and Palestinians are themselves Semitic people. The Palestinian struggle, which includes a broad, diverse group from various backgrounds, is against the state of Israel and its oppressive, inhumane, and unequal treatment of Palestinians. This struggle for human rights is not a racist struggle. It is an anti-racist struggle. The critique of Zionism at the heart of Palestinian advocacy is a critique of racist and oppressive state policies. Zionism is a nationalist movement that arose at a particular historical moment, as Khadija's video showed us. It does not now, nor has it ever represented the will of all Jewish people. To be anti-Zionist is therefore to be critical of a nationalist movement and the state-sanctioned policies of apartheid foundational to that movement. This is not the same as being against all Jewish people. If you hear such false narratives and false equivalencies, we encourage you to challenge them and speak up. Speak to the reality facts on the ground, the human rights violations that Palestinians endure, the role of the US government in unequivocally supporting politically and financially the Israeli government as they commit human rights violations. When folks try to confuse the situation and confuse you with getting bogged down in meaningless details and arguments that carry you away from the facts and ongoing reality of the violations of Palestinian human rights, return to the well-documented facts and the reality of what is occurring on the ground for Palestinians on a daily basis, even beyond the ups and downs that the mainstream news media is more apt to cover. Next, we encourage you to challenge narratives that it is not our place to comment on Israel-Palestine as Americans, and that it is too complex of an issue to have an opinion in support of Palestinian human rights. An ally does not have to be an expert to speak up for Palestinian human rights. One doesn't need a PhD on any issue of human rights to have and demonstrate compassion for oppressed groups and to have an opinion that empathizes with them. Don't be intimidated by, quote unquote, not knowing enough. You have your heart and your commitment to helping others. Let social justice be your guide. The issue of social justice, whether in the US or in Palestine, belongs to all of us. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Don't be intimidated. Speak the truth that is in your heart. Next, we encourage you to know your audience. Engage with people who are willing to hear your perspective. If the conversation is not productive, redirect your energies. Some folks will try to intimidate you and wear you down through endless arguments that amount to nothing more than distraction and confusion. Know when to pull out of an unproductive conversation and when to redirect your energies elsewhere with people who are open to discussion and not operating out of defensiveness, intimidation, and aggression. And finally, we want to encourage you to not shy away. Do not shy away. Even if you don't engage in a conversation, be clear about your stance and opposition towards apartheid in Palestine. Don't be afraid to simply say, I stand for Palestinian human rights, and leave it there. Registering your opposition to oppression and violation of human rights and staying strong in your truth, even if you disengage, says a lot. Remember, you got this. And AMENA-Psy and many, many others have your back. You are not alone. We are stronger together.
So I can probably go ahead and wrap us up here. For any questions, please take this moment and put them in the chat. But also want to just give our social media handles as well as the resource document that we had referenced earlier on. We have readings, books, websites, articles, anything that you may be interested in. This will be live, kind of a living document on our website. And so this QR code will take you to our advocacy page where you can find not just our statements, but the resource document as well. And these are, our Twitter handles. We really hope that you can reach out to us, connect with us. We also have the AMENA-Psy conference coming up if you are interested in learning more about Arab MENA psychology and the research that is being currently done at this time. But I want to take a moment too and just really thank our presenters today and SAS again for this educational webinar. This is just an introduction. We do plan on hosting various series or other webinars, educational, informational videos and Zoom meetings in the near future related to this, because we know that this is just at the beginning, just an overview that we hope can empower attendees to kind of get the ball rolling and you can have some language. And now we'll go to our questions. If you cannot use access the QR code at this time, you are able to go to AMENA-Psy. It's better if you do the www at the beginning. I've learned that without that, it doesn't work. .amenasci.org/advocacy or use the QR code. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can come back.
Thank you so much, presenters. I just want to echo the gratitude for your vulnerability and openness and the incredible just practical advice you've provided today that's been shared in the chat. I also want to encourage the audience, please keep sending in questions that you like to have addressed through the Q&A function. We'll give it another minute here so we can continue to build up a pool of questions. And as additionally, we have some topics that attendees shared interest in during their registration, and I thought I might start out with one of those. So we had a registrant share an interest in hearing a little bit more about specific tips for digital advocacy and engaging in discussions online, both in professional and personal spaces related to Palestinian human rights. And I wondered if any of the group would like to speak on that.
Khadija, do you want to take this on tips since you're social media?
It hiccuped during the first half of your question, and that's why I didn't say anything.
Oh, gotcha. We had a registrant express interest in hearing any advice you all might give on advocating for Palestinian human rights in digital spaces, like resources you might share or just strategies for those spaces in particular, in contrast with person-to-person interactions in person.
I think sharing online is so important. It's been so powerful. And honestly, people sharing online, getting more information out in the most recent, I guess, war on Gaza a couple of weeks ago in May. The reason why that was able to stop and it gained momentum was because people were posting online. And that could be retweeting a tweet that reaches your network. It could be reposting an Instagram post. I think offhand, a couple good Instagram accounts to follow. I like Decolonizing Palestine a lot. Jewish Voice for Peace, I think they're a good one to follow as well. I can think and then like post a list online at some point. But I think that, it's just really important and that you should do it. That's what my short or the long is. And then Lemi said in the chat that it's important that we follow Palestinian journalists and professionals and others in Palestine online. And I'm going to echo that because that's really important. And she mentioned MENA Al-Kurd, and she's a really good one. Thank you for mentioning that, Lemice. She's a journalist in Palestine, and she was living in the city that Sheikh Jarrah that was, I don't know if you guys have heard, but they were trying to make the people of Sheikh Jarrah bulldoze their own houses down and or become the tenants in their homes that were theirs for generations to Israeli settlers. But her and her brother have been some leading forces on sharing the news worldwide.
Thanks so much. And if folks have additional accounts and handles you'd like to share with the group, please feel free to drop those in the chat. Another theme of questions that we received in the registration process was around, and the presentation touched on this, but I wonder if anyone want to elaborate, supporting Palestinian colleagues, peers, fellow faculty members, clinicians in training spaces, steps that may feel especially supportive or helpful that you'd recommend.
I'm sorry, Gloria, can you repeat, like, is the question, what can we do to support?
Yeah, particular steps in training spaces that members of the group might recommend.
I'll kind of start that, but I think everyone can chime in as well as I'm talking. But, you know, I think everything that Layli had mentioned, you know, in those 2 slides holds in all spaces, including training spaces. And I think recognizing how historically training spaces have minimized, neglected, you know, Arab and MENA psychology and their experiences. Speaking up, even just mentioning it, just saying that it is an area that's neglected is very important, acknowledging that and not just continuously like brushing it under the rug, because it's so much that they'd have to, you know, learn about now in order to talk about it. I don't think that there's any other psychology topic where any faculty or you know, supervisor feels like they must be an expert in order to speak about it. And so why is this any different? And just even acknowledging the lack of knowledge, you know, sometimes can be helpful, just knowing that you see us, that you recognize this as a limitation. Of course, not to put the burden on the Palestinian trainees or, you know, MENA trainees in general to educate, but how can we do this together? Like, I want to support in that, or finding resources. And outside of this, I think, you know, just AMENA-Psy is now established and is a space for allies, you know, and people who are interested in Arab MENA psychology to join. We have a Friend of AMENA-Psy membership option for anyone who is interested, but just didn't have that opportunity, that space to get access to, you know, what is kind of going on. So those are some, you know, action steps, I think. And we're always, you know, putting new material on our website as well and resources on how to be more active in supporting Arab MENA psychology professionals.
I'd like to, oh, go ahead, Layli. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I also wanted to add with regard to the supervisors who might be out there and any other professors who are teaching, the idea of including more curriculum, especially in group didactics and whatnot, with regard to Arab and MENA people generally, and specifically Palestinians. Again, we want to direct you to our resource page, direct you to AMENA-Psy and the advocacy committee. We have a curriculum subgroup that we're working on because there has also been an effort across the country and specifically in the state of California to erase Palestinian and Arab MENA history and identity from the curriculum. So this can be another way to bring, you know, to bring in more of our history, Palestinian history, make people feel comfortable and included, and also to learn yourselves if there's more learning. And I mean, I think we're all constantly learning through the process.
I just wanted to add quickly that I also think, as we mentioned, you don't have to have a PhD in order to speak on the human rights abuses that are going on to any oppressed group all over the world. And in order to be a true ally, all you have to do is truly just listen and be open to hearing about those atrocities that are occurring. And as a true ally, what you can do as an individual in order to influence everyone around you to listen and be aware of these issues. A lot of people think that, it's really, really quote unquote, problematic to speak on human rights abuses because you're afraid to, sort of, offend people. But the truth of the matter is that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you are choosing the side of the oppressor. And that's one of my favorite quotes by Desmond Tutu. And so it's really important to speak on these human rights abuses. And as supervisors, as psychologists, as people in this field, like I said, it's absolutely within our scope of practice. And training programs, it's like, as Layli said, it's important to include these types of advocacy efforts and curriculum into their curriculum for trainings in order to, allow trainees to see the issues at hand.
Thank you all for speaking on that, and just in general to MENA-Psy for the incredible resources and scholarship that you have produced in the organization's lifetime so far. There have been requests for the link to the MENA-Psy resources here in the chat. So just want to let attendees know we're working on pulling that up so we can provide it to you. There was a question in the chat about responding when one is advocating for Palestinian human rights and just speaking to human rights abuses Palestinians face, that just bringing up this topic as anti-Semitic. What are some suggestions, or could you elaborate on some suggestions for responding to those criticisms? Oh, here, I'm going to read Denise's comment out just so I capture it accurately. So how do we respond to that's anti-Semitic comments just when mentioning the abuses of Palestinians?
I can touch on this for a little bit, and obviously welcome others to touch on this. But as Layli mentioned in her part of the slides, I think it's important to remember that, being anti-Semitic essentially means that you are against the existence of Jewish people or the Jewish religion. And if you are critical of the Zionist movement, you are not critical of Jewish people being Jewish. You are critical of a nationalist movement that came into power at a specific historical moment that is oppressing Palestinians and forcing them to be removed from their land. So if you talk about what's going on in Palestine, it's not anti-Semitic to bring up, human rights abuses, just like it's not, you would never, for example, ask, people like Black Lives Matter, Black folks to sit in the same room with white folks, right? Or their oppressors if they're talking about racism, for example, or slavery. You wouldn't force them to be in the same space, basically collaborating and saying, let's talk about both sides. It's very, very oppressive, and it can be very, very demeaning for the people that are being oppressed. And so I think it's important to uplift the voices of the Palestinians and the human rights abuses that they're enduring, because again, if this is something that silences us by hearing, oh, it's anti-Semitic, then it's a false equivalency, and we have to address it.
I was going to say something, but Mohammed hit the nail on the head. Criticism of Israel is criticism of a government. We don't ever look at the US and criticize the government and then call people anti-American. Or that's just not a common thread. Criticizing a government is not, A, is not criticism of its people, and B, is not criticism of a faith.
Thank you. And just to sort of elaborate on that, so we received a question specifically about sort of navigating these conversations as a student. So I'll read the comment here. So thanks so much for hosting this powerful and very needed presentation in this space. How do you recommend navigating the space as an individual student when you try to bring up this topic and get shut down by higher administration or faculty?
Mind if I take a little stab at this one first, you guys? I appreciate the person who is who said that, because I think that it's really scary and it's discouraging, you know, after doing it a couple times and feeling like every time you do, you get beat down. I will say that, you know, when we're kind of siloed in our own spaces and we don't have that support of other colleagues or psychology peers, it makes it so much harder. And it's not an easy thing to do because of how pervasive, you know, the oppression of Palestinian advocacy is within counseling, clinical psychology programs. It is, it's really tough. So I can't, you know, we're not here to say that this is easy to do, because for all, you know, all we know is that most people have been taught to not talk about it or to silence it. And what I would suggest is, if anyone is, you know, wanting to be more vocal on advocacy, build your support first. Join, if you're of MENA background or supportive of Arab MENA psychology and advocacy, join AMENA-Psy, because without this network, it would have been impossible to even host this. You know, so if you're looking for support, some place to be able to regain some energy and talk about strategies, we do that often, especially as students. You know, we have a really large student membership. Actually, majority of our organization is student members. And so we kind of help each other as much as we can, and we host other support spaces. So that's what I would say, like at this time within the psychology network. I think in other spaces and other graduate programs in higher education, it can be really tough if you don't have that. But build a support group first, know your people, know your allies, know the faculty and the people who have power, and build really strong relationships with them so that you can always turn to if people do try to target you. So have some people with power kind of in your back pocket as well. And then please, anyone else give some suggestions, but something I hear all the time as member at large student slate. So I know how tough it is, and it's everywhere.
I also want to encourage folks that are here, if you know of these situations that are occurring in graduate institutions, in training programs, please let us know. Please contact the MENA-Psy, contact us, because like Bahar is saying, when there is power in a collective, that is powerful, and we can respond in a systemic way, such as putting on these types of webinars and events. So please contact us, let us know when these events are happening. Don't feel like you have to be silenced and that you have to sort of, you know, be oppressed because of it. You're not alone. We're all here for you.
Gloria, I know we only have a few minutes left. Are there any like short, smaller questions, or do you
we have a question here, I guess, that extends to advocacy at the policy level and the federal level. So are there any U.S. congressional calls to action that attendees can support that you're familiar with, or other policy level action steps that you'd recommend that we haven't touched on today?
I can take this. To answer this question very succinctly, a couple of months ago, the Advocacy Committee published a statement on what's going on in Palestine. It's currently listed on our website under our advocacy page, and in it, there are specific action steps, including congressional advocacy and bills that are currently in progress in Congress, and in order for you all to look at and to support. So if you have any questions or if you have any others that you come across, please let us know or you know, contact us.
Awesome. Thank you again for all that you've shared today, and all the work that goes on behind the scenes in AMENA-Psy student and advocacy committees, and and your individual work and activism. I want to acknowledge to attendees that we received some excellent questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to, but we would love to continue our programming and developing resources around these topics. So please feel free to reach out to us with continuing programming interests. I'm going to drop Sas's email again in the chat. Any final thoughts, presenters, that you'd like to share for today before we wrap up?
There's just really, I'm sorry to say this, there's just one really quick question that was actually asked by one of our advocacy committee members, Dr. Alice Cicero. And it's sort of about the parallels between settler colonizing of indigenous land where we live and the parallels between settler colonizing of Palestine. And in both cases, ignoring that the land was already populated. So to quickly answer that in a very succinct way, I 100% agree, and this is problematic, which is why I always think it's important to start off with a land acknowledgement wherever we are. So that's something personal that I like to do. So, but again, remember, we're going to be having future events and webinars, so we can always present on this topic as well in the future.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mohammed. Yes, we will be on the lookout. If you're interested in being part of like future programming and all that, please reach out to MENA-Psy and join us as a friend. And thank you again, Sas, for hosting this for us.